morning. Good morning, Senator. I know
Good.
that we have a lot to get to with domestic policy and some movement that's happening in the Supreme Courts, but I know that we wanted to engage our viewers and update them on the stuff that's happening with Iran and America. Could you give us kind of a brief update on where we stand? We kind of touched on it last week, but there has been definitely some new engagements and kind of talk within our own leaders and Iran as well.
Yes, and this will be fairly brief, but I think, certainly within the next 3 days, everything will be in place. All of the aircraft, the ships and so forth, ready for an attack on Iran. Keep in mind, this is an unprovoked attack. This is a Pearl Harbor type of attack. But we're on the giving end rather than Japan. Now, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of buildup, and I believe that the movement was this is not a bluff. This is the real deal. But the president has just recently said that this could end up being a kind of a surgical strike, a little bit like it was the last time. Now, the last time, I think there was a decision made. We had a 12-day war with Iran, and I think the decision was made to very, very much narrow down the scope of the U.S. attack for various reasons, whatever political reasons we had, and to make it more of a show than anything. Now, it's not that it was not consequential, but it was far less so than it needed to be. So we have that possibility coming up again. Now, the fact that President Trump is announcing that we could have a limited strike really raises two possibilities. One possibility is that it's just something said to relax the other side to where they let down their guard just before the attack. That wouldn't be surprising at all because we have a history of that type of thing. The other thing is that there's a very real possibility that people have been hammering the White House, saying, "Look, you've got these midterm elections coming up, and if you don't get serious about them, we could end up having a massive wipeout. The chances are we're going to lose the House." I say we because I'm a Republican. The chances are we'll lose it, but it depends on how you lose it and by how much you lose also. And I think within the Republican Party, there's a real desperation to draw back from all of these frenetic foreign ventures where, we invade this one, invade that one, and attack this one, and blockade that one, and draw back to the origins of the MAGA movement, which was America first, make America great, America first. And there's a large element of the party that simply wants to stop all of the wars and so forth overseas. Clearly, like with Ukraine, the Ukraine war would not be going on if it were not for the U.S. Quietly orchestrating the whole thing and getting intelligence to the Ukrainians and so forth. We keep that going, and we keep the bloodshed rolling in. We have not, we've not set about ending that war, and with Iran, clearly we have been following orders from Netanyahu, telling us we want this, we want that. Netanyahu, I think, is at war now with 7 different countries simultaneously. Israel obviously cannot do that. So the globalist billionaire backers of Israel have basically laid down the law with the Trump administration, saying, you've got to be the backer of Israel. You've got to back up uh, the policies, no matter how aggressive, no matter how violative of international norms they might be. I'm hoping, because I really just don't want to see the massive slaughter of Iranians, and I'm hoping that this talk about a limited strike may have some validity, that it's not just a hoax, and that will do something that gives the president the political cover he needs to sort of declare victory and get the troops on home. So anyway, that's where we stand right now, and we'll probably know within a week or so what's going to happen.
Yeah, we have some of the friends of our show, or friends that we kind of lean towards for some of this specific analysis of, like Scott Ritter or Colonel McGregor, are really sounding the alarm on the imminent danger of us going into a direct conflict with Iran. And I think in that sentiment, you have a significant push for members within the Trump administration pushing the president to take these actions. But I think the silver lining is that you also have some people who are trying to push back. Unfortunately, one notable one that probably had significant pull would have been Charlie Kirk, but he was assassinated last year. Right before the 12-day war, it was a known thing that he went to the White House and made his opposition to the engagement with Iran very well known. So much so that they said that had somewhat of a significant impact in the administration's posturing towards what the engagement with Iran. So I think that is somewhat of a silver lining to look at, and then we could aid those individuals that are speaking out against this, that are close within the administration, to keep doing so, because we don't want to see the slaughter of Iranians and of American troops. So I think with that, I think we wanted to transition to some new news that came out yesterday, which is the Supreme Court ruling on the tariffs that Trump has enacted. I think I put that on too long. Do you want to give us a briefing on that, Senator?
Yeah. Let's talk about this. This is very important domestically and in terms of foreign policy. President Trump, I think even long before he took office this time, he has been very forthright with people that he wanted to use tariffs. He wanted to revise the way that we do our foreign trade. He has, this is not something where he pulled a rabbit out of the hat and he's doing something that he didn't promise that he was going to do originally. This is exactly what he promised. He imposed a very massive tariff regime, and he's used tariffs as a very muscular part of his overall foreign policy, because he'll often threaten, well, I'll have 100% tariffs on your goods, and then some foreign country that's faced with potential bankruptcy backs off a little bit on their position. The tariffs, they're very interesting. The Supreme Court has knocked down the tariff regime entirely. This is not just saying, well, you're going to have to modify this or modify that. It's a complete rejection of the legality of the tariffs. Now, and I don't want to just talk about sort of the right and wrong of tariffs, because you can certainly argue that the tariffs were meritorious in some ways. All of the doom and gloom about what would happen if we had tariffs really turned out not to be accurate. I'm not sure, Morgan, whether you were taught when you were in school about how terrible tariffs were and how they caused the Great Depression. That's always been quietly debated, but it's all in all the history books. And and I think to some extent, President Trump succeeded in disproving that timeless assertion. I mean, literally, when I was a little boy in school, I was taught about the Great Depression and how the the Smoot-Hawley tariffs had brought down the world, and there, even though there were voices that said, "No, that's not quite correct. That's not accurate." It was already out there, and it was in print, and so that's what I learned when I was growing up. So I suppose Trump can say he certainly overturned that. Um, but the the Supreme Court now Trump was furious at the Supreme Court justices, and I think including the Republicans, because it was kind of a bipartisan Supreme Court where you had some of the Republican appointees and some of the Democrats, and they had a 6-3 majority, and and so Trump just blasted them all. He says this is a disgrace and so forth. Um, but but I think it's interesting to look at what's going on because, and not just from a political standpoint, but from a legal standpoint. Um, if you go back to the Biden administration, it was conservative Republicans who fought legal battles against executive branch overreach, and the one which was of enormous importance to a decision that was enormous importance to conservatives was West Virginia versus EPA, decision that was announced in 2022, but that litigation had been going on for years. And the Environmental Protection Agency had tried to use the Clean Air Act to implement this climate, this great green climate policy where we were going to zero out all of the fossil fuels and we were going to use windmills and sun chips and the world would be wonderful and there would be roses and you didn't have to, don't think about what happens when the sun goes down and solar doesn't produce energy. Don't think about what happens when the wind stops blowing and the windmills stop turning. Just do it and just assume everything's going to be fine. Well, anyway, in West Virginia versus EPA, the conservatives said that they really established this major questions doctrine, and the EPA was using rationales and so forth that they hadn't been hammered out by Congress. Congress hadn't had this great debate because, when you talk about the national energy supply, you're talking about something that affects literally every human being, from somebody who's homeless on a sidewalk to somebody like Bill Gates or, one of these, almost trillionaire people. Every single person is affected when you talk about the entire energy grid. And so the Supreme Court sort of put in their doctrinal law that Congress can't be assumed to have made a decision just because of some ambiguous language in a particular particular law that's passed. In this case, it was the Clean Air Act. That they said when you're claiming claiming authority of vast economic and political significance without clear congressional authorization, then you trigger the major questions doctrine. And the major questions doctrine says that Congress cannot be assumed to have delegated authority to the executive branch without explicit congressional action. So if Congress had wanted to say, okay, we're gonna really knock out all of the fossil fuel and and explain to the public through congressional hearings and so forth what all this would entail and how massive it was. If they had done that and then they explicitly said you can knock down you can shut down all the coal-fired power plants and do all these other things, the Congress could have passed a law to do that, and then the president and the executive branch could have implemented it. So this doctrine, what it did, it was so important to conservatives because prior to this, we had shifted so much governmental power to unelected bureaucrats in the various executive branch agencies. And we had insulated those bureaucrats from the president himself. He didn't have the power to remove them. Well, the Supreme Court has gradually restored the president's authority to remove people who aren't in line with what his administration wants done, so that if something goes wrong, he can remove people, he can change direction. But of enormous importance is the fact that the major questions doctrine gives back to Congress not just the authority, but also the responsibility to face the American people and say, okay, we're closing down your power plant and we're making a gamble that maybe you won't need so much power at night, when you come home from work and when you're cooking supper and when your wife is back and she throws clothes into the washer and all this tremendous load on the grid. We're going to pretend it doesn't exist. You'd have a debate in any event. And so Congress, under the major questions doctrine, Congress must speak clearly and unambiguously when it implements something of vast economic and political. And okay, so that was one Biden era decision. The decisions actually were announced a little bit, years after the litigation started. But here was another one: Biden versus Nebraska. The decision was made 2023. Joe Biden made a decision that, for political reasons, obviously, that he was going to cancel almost $500 billion in student loan debt. He was, we didn't want to burden young people with the debts that they had incurred, and so we just write them off and shift them to the taxpayer. And we would ignore the people who had already paid their debt and, where that put them. We weren't going to give them back their money. So it angered a lot of people. It angered a lot of voters, just ordinary people who had paid off their student loan debts, as I did. I didn't take much debt because I worried about being able to repay it. But that was in a different era when people paid debts. And now we just print money. But in any event, that was a case where the Supreme Court ruled against President Biden and said that the Department of Education could not invoke something called the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act had, I don't know, it had something to do with student loans, but it did not clearly and explicitly authorize the massive loan cancellation that Joe Biden had ordered. It may have had something in there that gave some flexibility to forgive some loans or to, hesitate to collect them or something. But in any event, it did not authorize this massive transfer of wealth. So, and I think conservatives all celebrated both of these because they showed that this was the checks and balances that were designed in our system between the congressional and the executive branch, legislative and executive branch, and it restored power to the people who elect their representatives to Congress and who elect the president, and it just kept each part of government within its own wheelhouse, which is enormously important because if you don't do that, then you lose the republic. The republic cannot stand when you have an enormously powerful president who just rolls over everybody, or if you have a Congress that just eats away his authority until he's helpless. So that was important. And so it is interesting because there are a lot of really fine conservatives who are now up in arms at the Supreme Court for what they've done. I'm not one of them. I wince a little bit about what's going on, but the preservation of the republic after the next few years that President Trump is in office is of such enormous importance that we've got to retain the structure of our government. And I think the decision about the tariffs is of enormous importance. Now, the decision that was made, it went off on a law that President Trump used the IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And this gave the president some flexibility to work with tariffs, but it was limited. It was limited power. It wasn't some sweeping, enormous power. Mm-hmm. And that's why the Supreme Court said that is just not significant. It's not sufficient because it did not explicitly authorize the implementation of some massive tariff regime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a large part of their ruling, correct me if I'm wrong, that they reaffirmed that the tariff is a tax, and so therefore that is only delegated towards the Congress whether to add a tax to the American people or not. Now I know that through that ruling, or that law, the what was it again? The IPEA.
IPEA, yeah.
Yes. So that ruling is attached to that law. Yeah. But I guess.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Did I say it wrong?
Well, I'm not sure. IEEPA. So.
Okay. I think. Okay. But I know that Trump has now imposed new tariffs, citing that he is pulling from the Trade Act of '74. What are your kind of thoughts on that?
he has clear authority to implement a 10% across the board tariff under that. I believe that's the one.
Mhm.
He has already signed. He's already signed the executive order authorizing the 10% tariff. Now, there's no question. I don't believe that whether he can do that, because that I think was explicitly authorized. But as I understand, and I haven't studied this in depth, but the that 10% tariff lasts for 150 days unless it is reauthorized by Congress, which would be an explicit authorization.
Mhm. Okay.
It's interesting. The Wall Street Journal and New York Times, they're saying that foreign leaders and foreign corporate executives seem to be assuming that in some form or fashion the tariffs will remain in place. And there's no doubt that that the Trump administration is determined to forge on and define whatever authority they can to to enforce the tariffs. And if it can be done, if it can be done legally, then
Mhm.
more power to them. Um, but I think, once the Supreme Court has acted, um, they're going to be kind of alert to something that does exactly the same thing again using some different statute.
Mhm.
So I don't think they'll get too far with it, but we'll have to wait and see. There's just a lot of uncertainty.
Mhm.
Um,
Certainly, yeah, but it's all very, very interesting. And I know anecdotally, some people I know that work in a lot of different fields, like furniture making to the components that go into like computers and stuff like that. Tariffs have actually been a very big issue, dating back all the way to the first Trump administration with the tariffs that were coming out of China initially. So it has somewhat had an effect on, some forms of, different ventures, I would say. But it's always very, very interesting to look at and see what kind of what will happen in the coming weeks given this ruling. Now I know
yes,
that we.
I do hope that there is some way that we can, and maybe Congress, if Congress could ever do anything for the people instead of just
Mhm.
the way that they function. Uh, we need tariffs. We needed tariffs back when the textile industry I think in the Carolinas it
Yeah.
was a booming, thriving industry that employed a lot of blue collar families, and it was President Clinton who signed the NAFTA agreement and stripped all protection from American workers and began shipping factories right and left. I mean, thousands of factories were shipped right over the border into Mexico and China, different places. No consideration whatsoever to American workers. And they knew what was going to happen. This wasn't some sort of collateral damage that nobody had thoroughly thought through. The whole purpose of NAFTA was to shift wealth to other countries and to take it from Americans. And
Mhm.
you saw this. The textile industry was another one. I think it was big in Virginia. I think it may have been even in Massachusetts. I'm not sure, but um, you had a lot of people. They did hand. They would take. If they were making men's shirts, they'd be there and they'd do different things, and you'd have an assembly line, but each person was actually working with a sewing machine and so forth. And just, one day those families had good income and a way to raise their families. And the next day, there were cities down in Mexico where people there had those abilities, and more power to the Mexicans to do things, but a country has an obligation to protect its own citizens. And the idea that we would just knowingly and deliberately sell out a huge portion of the American workforce was just incredibly arrogant and elitist, because they knew, oh, well, these are, poor people. A lot of them were in the South. A lot of manual labor was done in the South because it was, it didn't industrialize as quickly as the North. A big part of it was because of the Civil War. And so, after generations and generations, they had figured out, okay, well, there are things that we can do where we will supply labor, and the industries of the North can take advantage of our labor. And then I think the Clintons said, we don't care about those people in the South. Hell with them. We'll wipe them out, and we'll enjoy chuckling about it over our cocktail glasses in the evening. So, but just one more thing here about the tariffs before we go on. The Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 1 talks about the legislature. Article 2 is the executive branch. Article 3 is the Supreme Court and the court system. So, every school child needs to learn 1, 2, 3. You've got to be able to count to 3. And those are the 3 branches of government. The first one is the Congress. Second one is the president. Third one is the Supreme Court. And so the powers of each one are outlined. In some cases, they're vague. In some cases, they're overlapping. But in others, they're very precise. And the taxing clause of Article 1, which is Congress, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, says the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Now, tariffs in the law are legally classified as duties. So when it says Congress shall have the power to lay duties, that means Congress. It doesn't mean anybody else. And there is no overlapping authority that is sufficiently clear in the executive branch to where the executive, in my opinion, has the authority to reach down. So in any event, I think the Supreme Court was on very, very sound legal ground. I think it would have been awkward to justify ruling in President Trump's favor on the one hand, and then you're using this major questions doctrine against a Democratic president on the other. So I think this was a case where you saw the court doing what the court should do, saying, "Hey, look, we have to rely on the law and not just on what we want to do." And I'm glad that they did it. I wish the tariffs would have worked better for the president, and maybe he'll be able to figure something out on them. But I want our government to succeed to where if we wiped out this major questions doctrine, I think it was Rand Paul who said, look, we could end up with a President AOC who uses some obscure law and then expands it enormously and says, okay, we are going to implement a socialist form of government and we're going to take away private enterprise. And And if we eliminated the major questions doctrine for President Trump, then she's going to be in a position to say, hey, look, I got a lot of votes. I should be able to do what I want regardless of the Constitution.
Mhm.
So we need that protection because God bless him, Trump's only going to be in office for just so long, and somebody else will come. It might be a Republican, it might be a Democrat, but whoever it is, we want each branch of government to be constrained to its own wheelhouse.
Yes, I certainly agree. I think it's important that we see our institutions like the judicial branch taking, a principled stance and, like you said, not kind of playing into partisan politics, because those are one of the institutions that we have to rely on to not do that. So, I think those are all very, very sound and important points. I know that we are going to run quite a shorter show than we normally do, and I do apologize to everybody. But I want to, if you have any last words, Senator, I know that, we have a lot going on with Iran and domestically with these tariffs. I think we did a very sound segment on the tariffs, but I know that Iran is kind of something that is in the forefront of people's minds, given the escalation that's happening. And you have
I would just close by saying that I certainly would urge the administration to wrap up what they're doing in Iran quickly. If you get involved to where you unleash the ISIS terrorists that we've moved from Syria into Iraq, and now we launch them into jihad against Iran. I think a full-blown war could end up probably killing some 3 million Iranians. And you think, oh, well, we've got to vindicate the protesters who are out there. Well, it was Mossad, which admitted that they started the protest. It's not that there wasn't dissatisfaction out there, but it had emerged into riots and violence. And so, that's on Israel. Israel got everybody hyped up and got out in the streets where the government felt that it had to use lethal force to, not to just dissolve. And so this idea that somehow we'll vindicate those deaths by going in and blowing apart this whole country, it's a large country. In the end, you look at what's happened in Gaza. We were going to help Israel vindicate the death of 1,200 people. 600 of them were civilians. We're going to vindicate that. How did we vindicate it? We have killed officially 72,000 people to vindicate the death of those 600 or 1,200, however you want to count it. So is the life of an innocent Israeli worth the lives of, over 50, let's say 50, maybe 60, 65 innocent women and children in Gaza? Mm-hmm. And international law and history says absolutely not. It was condemned when Adolf Hitler approved the reprisal that was taken in Italy when there were some Italian SS type folks who were ambushed. A bunch of them were killed, and the Germans very, very carefully designed a reprisal that would be in accordance with international law, and they decided we're going to kill 10 people. Since there's no way to identify who did it, we're just going to take 10 people, we're going to execute them. And that was criticized for many, many years afterwards. Well, here we are in Gaza, and the number 72,000 is obviously way low because there's no mechanism to count anymore. So it could be up to 200,000 by now. We don't know, but it's a huge number, and they're still when the peace agreement was signed, we the Israelis went on and they killed 600 people officially after. So
Yeah.
And you think that's 600? That's the number of Israeli civilians. I think that was the number of civilians. The others were military people who were killed. So that's roughly it's in the ballpark. So
Mhm.
in a time of peace, they've killed as many civilians as were killed in the other action. Well, anyway, I know you've got to get going, so maybe that'll be our final.
Yes, yes. And thank you for kind of bringing attention to what's happening in Gaza, because I hope it never leaves anyone's mind the tragedies that have happened there. And thank you so much, Senator, for all the input that you've done today. It was very, very important. And I would like to encourage everybody to tune in next week to focus on the news.
Thank you.